You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
I could have warned Matt Hancock not to give Isabel Oakeshott his phone for reasons I don't have time to go into. I certainly wouldn't have handed her my phone. Advice I proffer free of charge to Mr. Richard Tice. If you know, you know. But as the co-author of Hancock's recent apologia, time to surf on his appearance in celebrity television in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Matt Hancock is well and truly in the jungle now, tied to a tree and with several vipers descending upon him. Presumably, in the course of their research for the book, Isabel Oakeshott obtained access one way or another to a set of WhatsApp messages which have now written themselves into the history books. It's probably the first time WhatsApp has made it into the history books. But the messages that are uncovered, unveiled, between Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, the chiefs of the medical and scientific apparatus in the British state, other ministers, senior members of parliament, are so utterly damning that you certainly haven't heard the last of them. They will, of course, feature prominently in the public inquiry, which I've no idea when it will get underway or for how many years it will toil, but the vineyard will be full of Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages. Many things are revealed in these messages. The first is the state of absolute chaos which prevailed at the top of the British state, and now that we can see them, we can more easily understand how our country was amongst the worst in the entire world. Despite all the efforts to spin Boris Johnson's government as somehow a success on COVID, we were a catastrophic failure. Not only did a very significant number of our people die, particularly old people who were sent into the canyons of horror, otherwise known as old people's homes, to make way in the hospitals for the expected tsunami of COVID victims. They were sent into these old people's homes not just to die themselves, but to pass the virus on to others and kill them, staff as well as old people that were living in these residences. The crime, of course, does not end there. The crime of failure to prepare is one that the government and the opposition will completely fail to exculpate themselves from. I'm going to say something about the opposition here because it's very important that it's not just the government that is the scapegoat tied to the stake to be sacrificed. It's even very important, more important, that it's not just Matt Hancock who is the sacrificial lamb. It's vital to know that at a moment of great national trial, both the government and the opposition parties, and because he's the leader of the opposition, at Keir Starmer's door must lie the indictment that the British state failed and its opposition, its political system failed to hold the government properly to account, to question vastly expensive measures and decisions that were taken that cost not just lives but almost uncountable treasure. The opposition played the role of supporting the government every step of the way, except where the opposition were egging the government on to go even further down a road that now looks disastrously misconceived. Many things are revealed in the exchanges that are published in the Daily Telegraph, which, of course, is the publisher of choice for stolen material. Not so long ago, they were the publisher of the MP's expenses, which sent several members of parliament to prison and which utterly transformed the landscape of the British people's faith or otherwise in their parliamentary representatives. So although the Daily Telegraph is far from my paper, I take my hat off to them for both of these publications of stolen material. It's a pity they cannot see their way to adding their voice to the demands for the release from Belmarsh of the world historic publisher of the Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, the man who broke more stories than any other journalist in history. He was publishing stolen material, just like the Daily Telegraph did. And in all three cases, they were doing the public a service. The public interest defense in having done so is simply insurmountable, unbeatable. But one of the things that struck me as the father of young children who were marooned for more than 1 year of their young lives was the absolute clarity in the WhatsApp exchanges that putting masks on school children was not only not necessary, was not only useless, but was merely a piece of party political propaganda. It's exposed there, where Boris Johnson concedes that the children don't need these masks, but Nicola Sturgeon, the erstwhile First Minister of Scotland, is putting masks on her children, so we had better do so too to avoid a political rumpus with her. How shameful is that? Revealed also, and in the same vein, the rule of 4, the rule of 6, turns out to be scientific bunkum and was known to be bonkers by the high Hedians in the scientific and medical establishment and by the government ministers who were mandating it. That's important for me because our children were thereby precluded from playing football, from all extracurricular activities for more than 1 year on an entirely bogus prospectus, unnecessary and merely a political artifice. We haven't yet got to the issue of the vaccine, another of the trumpeted achievements of Boris Johnson. But if it is anything like the damning revelations of the early part of the crisis over COVID-19, well, it ought to lead to the imprisonment, certainly the trial of British government ministers and scientific and medical observers, advisors, the people who sat on the MIC, the medical industrial complex, who dragged us down a road that we didn't need to go and from which we may never recover. Not just the psychological trauma for so many of our people, made to suffer when politicians were doing the precise opposite. People were not allowed to sit next to their grieving mothers when their father was in a coffin in a funeral parlor. People were not allowed, even the Queen had to sit alone at the funeral of her late husband. The trauma that was visited on people who were not allowed to touch their dying family members or who were done up like spacemen in medical wards trying to communicate with dreadfully ill members of their own family, whether children to speak to their parents or parents to speak to their children. The trauma of having your operation postponed indefinitely because of the failure of the government to prepare for a pandemic. The trauma of medical staff who were faced with millions of people off whom the pants had been scared. One of the many damning WhatsApp messages is a discussion in which Matt Hancock discusses with his colleagues when they were, I'm quoting, when they were going to deploy the new variant maneuver to scare the pants off the public. Now, of course, that was not a zero-cost scare. That scaring, terrorizing, terrifying the British population by their own government was costly indeed to the mental health of the people, to the whole way of life of the people in this country. But of course, now that it's revealed, who now will believe any other message that comes from our government, that comes from the top echelons of the civil service? Not me, that is for sure. I myself deeply regret the extent to which I did believe them. I feel embarrassed, humiliated by the extent to which I did believe them. I'll never believe them again, will you? Now that we know that the vaccine was not as sold, now that we know that the virus was not the deadly catastrophe that we were told that it was, now that we know that masks were useless, now that we know that the rule of 4, the rule of 6, no sport, no walking in the park. You could walk in the park, but if you sat down for a rest on the bench, you'd get arrested. All of it now looks utterly ludicrous, absurd, and it is indeed a shame that so many of us went along with it. And I owe an apology to some of those, not all, but to some of those I, in effect, traduced for their skepticism. I would have been better being more skeptical myself. More of that, I'm sure, later. As you've heard me say before, the terrorist atrocity in the Manchester arena in 2017 was a matter of great importance to me. I was less than 1 mile away when the explosion occurred. I was myself in the environs of the arena as the scale of the catastrophe unrolled. And moreover, I had seen this coming. I had seen the gathering in the great city of Manchester of a group of people, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The clue was in the name. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group were deliberately concentrated in the city of Manchester by successive British governments and their organs of the deep state, one of which, MI5, has decided or been decided for them that they must take the rap for the mass murder of 23 people by a person whose name I shall not utter. Such scum, filth is he. I try not to mention his name, but I knew the community from which he sprang, and I knew that they had been deliberately concentrated there as an Islamic fighting group for future use against Gaddafi in Libya when the other organs of the British state decided that that was the right thing to do. The inquiry into events now more than 5 years ago has finally landed, and nobody paid it any attention at all. It's scarcely featured in the news and political landscape. Of course, MI5 made ghastly mistakes, mainly of failure to communicate with the police the kind of intelligence about the family of the mass murderer that they were in possession of. But MI5 are not the main culprits here. The main culprits are MI6, whose decision to use this group of head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart-eating, Islamist fanatic extremists in an English city as a kind of reserve army, a cell, a fighting cell in a great city in the north of England must take far more of the responsibility. And the prime ministers who oversaw that policy, starting with Gordon Brown, that paragon of virtue, as he now struts around calling for other people to be put on trial for war crimes, whilst being co-responsible for the biggest war crime of the century, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. He's the joint defendant in a future trial, either here or on the judgment day. He was the man who began the descent to the disaster that exploded amongst all those innocent children in the Manchester arena. And his predecessors played a big role also, and did his successors. I'm talking about David Cameron, the man who appeared on a balcony hailing the arrival of democracy after the brutal murder and sodomy of the Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi, the man who, with little Sarkozy, now in prison or awaiting prison for corruption in connection to Libyan gold and treasure, David Cameron shares responsibility, as does Theresa May, who gave them their passports. So that they could come and go to a war in Libya where they learned the deadly skills with which they murdered all of our children in the Manchester arena. The Royal Navy rescued the mass murderer himself and sailed him back to England, later to wreak such havoc and tragedy on the families of the 23 people who perished. There's so much more that I'd like to say, but time is against me. It is the mother of all talk shows. That I can promise you. Stay tuned. Were COVID lockdowns necessary? A, yes. B, no. You can vote on my Twitter, on my YouTube, on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway, or on the YouTube community channel where 11,000 have already cast their vote. A big shout out, by the way, if you're watching on Rumble. Let's get ready to rumble. Let's all watch on Rumble. Let's all get involved in Rumble, because it has suddenly become the second biggest portal through which people are watching the mother of all talk shows. And there was one week when it was not just first, but out the park first, with a six-figure number watching the show. Remarkable indeed. So you can vote. Were COVID lockdowns necessary? A, yes. B, no. Let me hit the phones to Lance in Canada. Go ahead, Lance.
Hello, George.
Hi there. What would you like to say? Yes.
I guess on geopolitical parts and geofinance, like your partners or the last guy said, I do believe that China is our friend. I mean, the way IMF loans and the way international banking works seems to be these loans go out and then these 30% type arrangement fees go back to the richest people in the world, people whose wealth is beyond what we even understand. They have poor front men, and who live near the poverty line, like Bill Gates out front. But I mean, the real wealthy people, and I guess we owe two sets of people. We owe the Chinese, who've made my life good. They make cheap petrochemicals, they make inexpensive televisions, they make I have great tools from China, and we owe this cabal of the ultra rich. So I don't know. Personally, I'd rather sink all the super yachts and pay the Chinese back. But anyway, that's my take on the world.
Well, it's a very good take. The show will be coming from China pretty soon. And I hope that technically it dazzles, as I'm sure that it will. but I'll be coming and going to China quite a bit over the next 12 months, if God spares me. And I view with horror this, as you implied, this 5 minutes of hate that people are being encouraged to, like 1984, George Orwell's training manual for the world we have today, where you literally scream hate at China. And of course, when you examine what is the basis for this hate, you can find not a scintilla of justification. We set up bases all around China and say it is to contain Chinese aggression, but they haven't set up any bases around us. They're not aggressing against us in any way, shape, or form. It is we who are aggressing against them. Their only crime is to have developed a system, a political economic system that is more successful than ours, and to overtake the United States already as the world's manufacturing leader, and to overtake the United States any day now as the world's biggest economy. That's the real crime of the Chinese people. All the rest is merely synthetic. It is manufactured. It's the only thing we can manufacture in the West, is lies about other people. The only thing we can manufacture in the West is war against other people. The only thing China doesn't manufacture is war. Just think about that. Back to the lines. Michael in Minneapolis. Always a pleasure. Michael, go ahead, sir.
Hey, George. Always good to talk to you. I'm a little confused, though, about your screed about masks. And you seem to be stating that you don't think that masks work. And I'm wondering if you're referencing the new scientific review published in Cochrane that analyzed different mask usage. And I think that, a lot of people have gotten the wrong idea about what the conclusion of that study was, because they brought together information from 78 different papers, but only 2 of those were analyzing COVID-19 mask usage, and both of those found that masks worked extremely well. The other papers cited in that study were studying influenza, which is not as contagious as COVID-19. So I'm just wondering if you were maybe fooled a little bit.
No, I wasn't referencing that. I was referencing the WhatsApp messages of Britain's Secretary of State for Health with Britain's Prime Minister and with Britain's Chief Medical Officer. I commend them to you. I wasn't referencing any study, Cochrane or otherwise. I was telling you what our own ministers who were mandating masks were saying to each other in their WhatsApp traffic. That's pretty damning, I think, Michael.
It is that is damning, but it's also confusing because the scientific literature, by and large, overwhelmingly supports the idea that masks work in limiting COVID-19 usage. And I can just say anecdotally, I've hardly had, I haven't even had a head cold since I started, wearing masks, going about, shopping and doing things like that.
Well, each to their own. I've said from the very beginning, one crime of which I definitely was not guilty was the crime of supporting compulsion in medicine, mandates in medicine, vaccine passports, and criminalization of people who took a different view. I opposed that from the very beginning, and I oppose it now. Right. And I would no more tell you to take off your mask than you'll be able to tell me to put one on. Michael, always a pleasure. I want to go to our first guest of the evening, a former U.S. Marine, a geopolitical analyst, founder of the New Atlas, and one of the biggest stars of the last 12 months on the mother of all talk shows and many other platforms. Because, of course, the war drags on. Brian Berletic, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. I wanted to take your counsel, your expertise, about where the land lies now, where the battlefield lies now, and what we might expect to happen next?
First of all, it's always an honor and a pleasure to come on. Thank you so much for having me. In regards to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, we have a lot of Western analysts claiming that Russia is engaged in what they claimed was going to be their winter offensive. But I have not heard any Russian military or political leader say that they were launching some major offensive. What I see instead is Russia putting pressure all along the line of contact on Ukrainian forces, in a way spoiling preparations by Ukraine to launch their offensive. And that is something that Ukraine has talked about. They've talked of nothing else but this spring offensive they have planned. And then, of course, Russian forces, the Wagner group, they are encircling Bakhmut, and Ukraine has invested heavily in trying to hold that city, and they are failing. And now it looks like they're beginning some sort of withdrawal. Of course, we cannot make any sort of prediction of how long that's going to take, because there's a lot of factors, including how well Russian defenses, as they close the encirclements, how well they can weather any sort of counter attack by Ukrainian forces.
I was going to ask you about Bakhmut. Everything moves much more slowly in this war. This is not the Six-Day War by any means, launched by Israel against its Arab neighbors. This is a war of attrition now, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, Russian military leaders, they have been talking about how the entire concept of what they are doing on the battlefield right now is to inflict attritional losses on Ukrainian forces. The whole point of putting pressure on Bakhmut and beginning to encircle it was to deliberately draw in as many Ukrainian forces and as much of their equipment as possible. And because of the political corner the United States and their proxies in Kiev have painted themselves into, they are obligated to do this for optics, and it is working in Russia's advantage. I was just reading a Wall Street Journal article right before I came on, talking about how the losses for Ukraine are so significant, it might actually spoil their spring offensive, which I believe is Russia's goal here.
500,000 casualties seems to be emerging as the consensus. 250,000 dead Ukrainians and 250,000 maimed and wounded and crippled in many cases forever. This is First World War level of losses, Brian, isn't it?
These are huge losses, and the unfortunate part is this is a proxy war being waged by the United States against Russia, and who is paying the cost for this proxy war? It is Ukraine. They're paying for it in blood. They're paying for it in the destruction of their infrastructure. And the United States is not paying anything at all. As a matter of fact, they're profiting from it, especially the arms industry, handsomely. And so there's no incentive for them to begin any sort of negotiation or stop this. And ideally, it would have been best if this never started at all.
Indeed so. We'd have to say, I certainly have no hesitation in saying, the Ukrainians have fought very bravely in this war. One might have expected, given the caliber of their political leadership, the ramshackle nature of their polity, their state, the ragbag of far-right and ultra-right nationalists and even Nazis in their ranks. You would not have expected them to stand up to the Russians so bravely and for so long. So let me ask you that question. Do you acknowledge that point I've just made?
I agree with that. I also believe it's a result of how Russia went about its special military operation. They could have assembled many more troops before they began. They could have went in much more forcefully. They only began dismantling, say, the power grid relatively recently. These were all things they could have done immediately, as as the United States would usually do when invading another country. And so I think it is a combination of, the Ukrainians were already on a war footing. They had been fighting in the Donbas region for 8 years. And between that and all of the weapons that NATO flooded into Ukraine, and then also because of the way Russia began the special military operation, I think these are all contributing factors to why both sides are fighting so fiercely now.
Now, if Ukraine mounts a spring counter-offensive, presumably that would be aimed at Crimea. Is Russia well placed to resist that?
It's hard to tell unless we know the disposition of troops on both sides. That's always a question, so we have to keep that in mind. But what I will say is that Ukraine, under much more ideal circumstances, launched their Kharkov and Kherson offensives, and Russia was able to blunt and then eventually stop both of those. They have mobilized since then. They have mobilized 300,000 additional troops, and they've created extensive defensive works in these areas. They are anticipating this spring offensive. I would say that Russia is in a much better position to slow down and then stop any Ukrainian offensive. And I believe the losses on Ukraine's side will be extremely severe. And then again, as I've said many times before, Russia, their goal is to demilitarize Ukraine. It's not to hold on to territory. They will give up territory temporarily to preserve their manpower, their equipment, because they know that if the Ukrainian army eventually falls apart, it doesn't matter how much territory they took in their offensive, Russia will be able to get it back. And we're actually already starting to see that happen around Crimea. The Russian forces are pushing back into territory that Ukraine took during their Kharkov offensive.
Given that the United States is paying no price, indeed, as you say, is profiting from the sacrifice on the battlefield of so many Ukrainians, and given that Zelensky will, let's face it, will not be running for president again, he's very unlikely to even see out his presidential term. He's more likely to end up in exile, very well upholstered exile, in one of his many palatial homes purchased in the very short time that he's been the president of Ukraine. And so nobody pays a political price for continuing to fight the war, is the point I'm making. There are no votes to be lost, only lives to be lost. And so you wonder, and I have wondered for a while, when the military officers, perhaps not the top brass, they may be as corrupted as the politicians, but junior officers say enough, no further. What do you think about that, Brian?
It's something that I hope for. I think a lot of people hope for, just to end this senseless proxy war. It's not really being fought in the best interests of Ukraine. As a matter of fact, again, at the expense of Ukraine's best interests. But unfortunately, for as long as Ukraine has a unified command structure, something like that is very difficult to develop in the middle of an armed conflict. I think it's very unlikely. I think something like that might start to happen as Ukraine's fighting capacity in general begins to collapse, degrade much more significantly than we've seen so far. Something like that is a possibility, but I wouldn't count on it.
Now, I was listening to Donald Trump in the early hours of the morning. If we park for a moment his unhinged attitude to China and concentrate on his attitude towards this war in Ukraine, he went further last night than he ever has, and he's been going quite far. His critique of the war is utterly damning. Absolutely correct in my view, but utterly damning. Not just, of course, of the Democrats who are in government, but the top Republicans that are effectively funding it and supporting it. Do you think that Trump will find an echo in the United States for these criticisms?
I think there is a growing segment of the Western public in general, and also the United States, who are frustrated with this and many other wars and proxy wars that the U.S. either already has going or is planning. You just mentioned China, that's where all of this is heading next. So I think so. He says a lot of things like that, which is why people vote for him. But then, unfortunately, last time he was in office, he surrounded himself with the very people who were engineering and executing these wars and proxy wars. So it's sometimes the right rhetoric, but again, it has a life of its own, and I don't think that elections, anyone getting into the White House is going to change it at this point. There's this continuity of agenda that we've seen for years and years in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and unfortunately, I think that's going to continue.
Well, one of the most salient facts of the last 12 months has been the success of American policy in subjugating Europe. Little soldier Schulz, the German chancellor or pretender, was utterly humiliated by Joe Biden. And that's quite an achievement, because Joe Biden can't bite his nails, as we say in Scotland, but he was able to there he is there on the front cover. Look at that. How damning is that front page of little Schulz with his rather cool-looking grandfather? The success of having bent Europe to its will, you can't take that away from Joe Biden, really, if you're looking at it purely from short-term American interest, Brian.
I agree with that. We have to remember, this is the U.S. waging a proxy war against Russia. The goal here is to weaken Russia, undermine it, divide and destroy it. But also at the same time, the U.S. seeks hegemony over all allies and adversaries alike. It was never in the cards for Europe to have any sort of independent foreign or domestic policy. It was always meant for the U.S. to dominate Europe as well as Russia. And then this extends to Asia as well. They don't want to see any nation with an independent, self-reliant foreign policy. And I think they've demonstrated that. If Ukraine is this proxy they're waging this war with, I believe it extends to all of Europe. Europe is also a U.S. proxy. And we can see leadership in Europe, if you could call it leadership, making decisions that favor Washington at the expense of European nations and the people living there.
German industry itself, and soon the blue-collar workers that operate it, will all be relocating to the United States. Biden officially offered to take German heavy industry, chemical industry, and so on to the United States, where it will have a more stable energy supply, says the man who blew up Germany's previously very stable energy supply.
It's very obvious what they're doing. They're eating their allies, and then eventually they're going to turn inward and begin eating themselves. This is a cycle that we've watched empires do all throughout history, and we see the United States going down this same unfortunate path. They did not want Europe to have any sort of constructive relationship with Russia because they wanted to encircle and contain Russia itself. And so they've cut all of these ties between Europe and Russia. They're left with the only option is getting much more expensive energy from the United States. And that will be indefinitely. That will never be as cheap as Russian energy was. And so, yes, the industry is going to have to move to the United States, but I don't think that is sustainable, and I don't think that Europe is going to recover as long as this is the arrangement and America has this influence over Europe. I think Europe is going to suffer.
Lastly, Brian, I'm always grateful for your wisdom. The U.S. tried to scare people that there was an imminent transfer of weaponry from China to Russia. In other words, China dropping any pretense of being in any way neutral in the conflict. That didn't come to pass. Why?
Oh, well, it's hard to tell. You couldn't blame China for wanting to support Russia because the United States has made it very obvious that China is next. They are going to be the next target. And everything that the US has done to Russia, they are also going to do to China. But we've been watching Russia. They have a very significant military industrial capacity. It seems to be doing much better than the combined military industrial capacity of the West. They have a head start. Maybe they don't even really need that type of support. China, India, many other nations around the world are supporting Russia in other crucial ways, helping them circumvent these sanctions that the US is targeting, the US and the EU are targeting Russia with. So maybe they really don't even need that type of support.
Brian Berletic, always a pleasure to hear from you. Thanks very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Were COVID lockdowns necessary? 18,000 people have now voted. And here's the results so far. On Twitter, yes, they were necessary, 22%. No, they were not, 78%. On YouTube, it's yes, 18%. No, 82%. On Telegram, yes, 16%. No, 84%. And on the YouTube community poll, yes, 19%. No, 81%. How utterly extraordinary. Let's hit the phone lines and go to Florida. Who wouldn't? There's Simon. Go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Well, whilst the world has been turning with other significant events, the National People's Congress began yesterday in the People's Republic of China, and there have been some very significant developments. The Chinese premier, in giving his working report to the Congress, said that the government would pursue its policy of the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, which are part of the trifecta with what many people in Europe are familiar with, but not the other two components of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is actually a three-legged stool. And to that end, he said that China would retain its fighting spirit in foreign relations with regard to its sovereignty, security, and development. When spokespeople were later questioned about the nature of this comment, which obviously can be interpreted in different ways, though from an American perspective is often seen as a quite warlike language. So sometimes when you're going through translation, it's necessary to get explanation of what exactly was meant. And the Chinese spokesman, Mr. Wang Chao, said at a press conference later that it was totally justifiable and necessary to make legislative efforts through its new foreign relations law to counter containment, suppression, and interference from external forces.
Well, I mean, that has the benefit of being true, doesn't it?
I would say that it's clearly, from a Chinese perspective, that's exactly what they want to do. This should be seen at the same time as they've announced that they're increasing their defense budget by 7.2% for the forthcoming year. But even though many people in the West are squealing about that increase, the Chinese defense expenditure as a percentage of the gross domestic product is still less than half of that of the United States.
Quite so. But they're not going to allow themselves to be outgunned. They cannot compete with the United States military prowess, which could destroy China many times over. But as the Chinese said, we know the US could destroy China many times over. We are content that we could destroy the United States only once. Thanks for that, Simon. Hope it doesn't happen. Brian is in Canada, but on the Manchester bombings. Go ahead, Brian.
Yes, it's sort of obliquely, but nevertheless something rather important, I think. Yeah. You mentioned something in passing when discussing the terrorist attack in Manchester. Namely, you would never call the murderer by his name. Now, simple enough, I suppose. Perhaps not in the United States, where the media has proved incapable of such a concept. In every horrific case of mass shootings, instead of calling the perpetrator a deranged coward, they name him, publish his photo, and delve into his background. In other words, giving the deranged coward the fame he seeks, often enough in death, a product of a deranged coward's twisted mind. This, if they do smart enough in this respect, will not stop this insanity. But thank God we can say, thankfully, these things, mass shootings, are one case of an American exceptionalism we can be grateful that we don't have. Thanks.
Yeah, very powerful point. Of course, there are arguments both ways. It's a matter of personal taste because the massacre in Manchester, where my daughter was born about the same time that other people's daughters were being murdered, my proximity to the scene of the crime, two of my children live in Manchester. It's very, very deeply personal to me. And the hideous, grotesque errors of judgment that have been made all along the line here were errors of judgment that I was pointing out at the time. There's no hindsight in this. I warned, in Gordon Brown's case, I warned him personally, man to man, about the dangers of concentrating in Manchester, in one part of Manchester, a cell of Islamist fanatics just because their enemy was also your enemy. It's this ugly concept of my enemy's enemy is my friend, but your enemy's enemy isn't always your friend. Oftentimes your enemy's enemy is worse than your original enemy. Oftentimes you are building a Frankenstein monster which will be out of control when it is built. And that is precisely what happened, I'm afraid, with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Pavsta Jat, what happened to Manchester United today, George? Well, I'm sorry that you wanted to rub it in publicly, but I've just online, on Twitter, congratulated Liverpool on an epic victory of 7-0, proving that my team is still a long way from being back, as some of us have liked to think. But just like when Hungary humiliated England at Wembley 65 years ago or so, they did England a favour, which woke England up and made them change their ways. And not many years later, England became world champions at the World Cup in 1966. So well done, Liverpool. Manchester United must be hurting. I know that I and all my sons are. Michael is in Seattle, always worth hearing, on COVID. Go ahead, Michael.
George, once more, a pleasure and a real honor to speak with you. Thank you. I recognize that your Socratic method on the on-air university is very beneficial, and I can only speak personally. I have appreciated because I had called last time in regard to the general strike, and you helped to really refine my understanding of that from a different point. And when it comes to COVID-19, I can only speak from an anecdotal and personal experience. I've had some variants of it 4 times since 2020. I had it in March 6th, 2020, and got very, very sick from it. So for me, I recognize that I'm speaking from a very personal and emotional perspective, but I've been very sick. So when the original lockdown came through, I was all for it because I have professionally done some work in population dynamics and epidemiology and biostatistics, and it seemed to me to make sense. And what helps, though, however, is in stopping everything, you have helped to educate. I guess the question is to whom and by whom, or Cui Bono, right? Who benefits from this process? And that is not something I think I was necessarily aware of in the past. So the question is moving forward. There's a lot of great statistical data on viruses and virology and a lot of knowledge base there. And I'm afraid that at times we may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to use that term. What say you, sir?
Well, I have not resiled from all of the views that I expressed, but some of them were plainly wrong. I was guided. I left school very early. I never went to university. I know nothing about science and nothing about medicine, but I trust my doctor. I trusted the Moat's doctor, Dr. Ranjit, both of whom, from the standpoint of their own learned careers, had a take on the matter, which perhaps we should get Dr. Ranjit on again. Maybe he doesn't share the extent to which I have acknowledged that I believe on one or two of the important issues I was wrong. We really should, out of fairness to Dr. Ranjit, get him on to comment on that. But I made the best judgments that I could based on the experts that I listened to and trusted, and still trust, by the way. But it's clear now that all of us, even our experts, were in part being misled. And it's clear now that whilst COVID is a real thing, caused real suffering, including to you, caused real deaths, there was a significant extent to which all deaths of people with COVID were being counted as COVID deaths when in fact it was the comorbidity that was actually killing the people. It's clear now, at least from the WhatsApp messages to which I referred, that even if you were over 80 and had comorbidities, your chances of dying from COVID were around 6%. If you were young with no comorbidities, your chances of dying from COVID were almost nil. Now, that was not clear. It was actually contended by many people that I insulted, and I feel bad about that. It was contended by them, but it was not revealed until now to have been the case. So they were keeping things from us. They were overselling both the lethality of the virus and the efficaciousness of the vaccine. They were completely fooling us, it seems, notwithstanding Michael in Minneapolis, about why we had to all wear masks, why we had to cut down our social interaction, groups of 4, groups of 6, no hugging our elderly mothers, no meeting up with girlfriends behind the bicycle sheds and so on. They were overselling it, overhyping it. And of course, all of these things taken together are bad enough. But when you calculate the devastating impact on the economy, well, that might end up killing more people than the virus killed. That might end up making more people sick through poverty than the virus made sick and made poor. Last word to you, Michael.
Well, thank you, George. Again, I think it's who benefits, and that is not necessarily something that I had addressed. I would suggest not to be so hard on yourself, as you are definitely making a decision in real time, the best that you can. What I would suggest is that there is, when it comes to population dynamics and the movement of viruses around the planet, there are at times, I think, when stopping everything is an appropriate method or an appropriate approach, hence my advocation of a general strike as well. When in a crazy world that is governed by illogic and irrational decision-making, stopping everything to take an assessment of where we're at and where we want to go and where we need to go, I think is an important thing. So I would just leave it with that.
Yours has been an important call, Michael, both for what you said and what you induced me to say. Thank you very much indeed. It's only the legendary Tommy in Glasgow on the line. Go on yourself, Tommy. The floor is yours. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good.
Alhamdulillah. God bless all your beautiful listeners out there. Tonight I'd like to talk on COVID. Now, I think I had it in March 2020. I certainly was tested positive in July last year. And I can attest as someone who suffers from a respiratory condition that started with asthma, but with my prolonged use of marijuana over 35 years, brought to a close, I must say, just a couple of months ago because of the severity of it. However, for myself, I was always inquisitive of that fact of smoking that you know, when you look at the decriminalisation, you know, when you can allow a drug like alcohol to be made legal and another one to not to be. So it always led me to having a question in mind. So you have nothing to be sorry about for you having your opinions, George, nothing to be sorry about at all. No one's perfect, but the fact you recognise it, all power to you. That takes a fine man to admit a mistake and to admit it to a million people. And for all the people out there to increase the fan base, retweet to retweet, tell 10 to tell 10, and give this man the money, because this show is amazing, absolutely. And thank you for allowing me on, George. What I would like to say is, for the vaccination, on that side, my son, who's 22, I got my first two children, my daughters, vaccinated against the MMR. The whole hype at the time caused me to look into it. Now, the thing was the triple loading of this vaccine. So I looked into it and paid privately for my son to have this vaccination. But the information that I got and was most telling and stopped me going to the conventional doctor to triple load my son was that in America, which is highly litigious for the medicine, normal vaccines were coming in at 50 cents that every drug has to be paid for by the drug company. This one for the MMR was over $5. So then that's what cost me to pay £130, drive through to Edinburgh and get it done. Now, my distrust of the medical industry, when they parked my aunt, who suffered from the yuppie flu at the time, it was called the ME, they parked her on these drugs, and it ended up taking her life, sadly, and the life of her husband. And for me, my disdain of the medicine industry, you know, the privatisation of profit and the publication of debt is what happens for the military-industrial complex, from everything, you know, and from the medicine. So for me, yeah, COVID definitely existed because I felt it and I've had it and it's really bad. But however, did it come from a lab? And have we been told a lot of lies? Yes, for the BBC. I mean, I change my phone every month, George, so that I can infiltrate these people, because the lies that they produce, the propaganda, is despicable. The text that you read out earlier on from Hancock and the government, I mean, how sick a country and a world we live in when we are told these lies. You know, and if you look at the economy, at the time when I was phoning the BBC and other outlets to say this is terrible just because I'm a part-time economist, if 1% of the GDP happens as a decrease, that takes just 10,000 lives in the UK. But the GDP decreased by 10% instantly. Well, this was taken over a period of time for the economic cycle, 100,000 people. So the untold cost of these dreadful lockdowns that never worked, every single measure at the time, for people like myself who are of the conspiracy mind that I just outlined earlier on, George, I'm of that conspiracy mind for decades, because, you know, I can't trust these people, and nobody should, because when
that's the nub of it, Tommy. The gravity is, and it didn't begin with this question, it began with Iraq, I think, that from the Iraq war onwards, so in other words, 20 years, if the government told you today was Sunday, you'd have to pick up the newspaper, if you were foolish enough to have bought one, and check. You'd have to, if they told you that the sun was going to rise tomorrow morning, you would still be in two minds as to whether they were telling the truth. And is this blow, which over 20 years, that all of our institutions, not just the government, not just politics, the BBC, not just journalism, but the law, the judges, the police, the civil service, all of our institutions, one after the other, is revealed to be rotten inside. And that's the cause of so many people's distrust on so many things. Thank you for a beautiful call, Tommy. Rob is in Cornwall on the teacher strike. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, sorry, mate. I'm Ross, actually. Sorry, not Rob.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right, Matt. Yeah, it's St. Piran's Day today, so it's an important day for Cornwall. Yeah, I just want to talk about the teachers' strike and what your opinion is, really, because, well, I'm a teacher, and we've obviously had in Cornwall and the Southwest 2 days of strike action already, and, you know, it's an amazing position to be in, really, and, you know, pushing yourself forward and, you know, fighting up for the rights of not only the teachers but also the children. I'm just wondering what your opinion was on the strikes.
Well, I have 5 children in education, if we count the youngest one at nursery, 4 at school, and I wholeheartedly support the teachers in their fight for decent wages. If you think that education is expensive, try stupidity. What price? Stupidity. Well, what price an undereducated young generation? What price an unmotivated and underqualified, because the best qualified will go and do something else or even teach somewhere else? So I'm 100% behind the teachers. I even visited their picket line where I live. I wholeheartedly support them until the end. Last word to you, Ross.
One of the things that we're striking for is that we're concerned about the future, like you've just said, and the fact that, you know, teachers, the retention of staff is reducing. The government aren't reaching their minimum standards or kind of amount of people that go into training either each year. And so it's a kind of a culmination of things, as well as the pay. Yeah. Obviously, the pay is important. But the reality is that, you know, in 10, 15 years' time, our concern from the NEU is that there won't be enough teachers to fill the places. And, you know, it's not just the money. Obviously, the money is important. You know, you're a professional teacher. You want to be paid a professional wage. But the issue that we have at the problem is a lot of the media don't mention the funding or the money that teachers got last year, the 5% rise, as the government likes to call it, was unfunded, which meant that any extra pay that the teachers were going to get were going to be given from the actual school budgets that were set that year. So they haven't been given any money from the government. So it's a culmination of concerns that we've got. And yes, we've done 2 strikes in the Southwest. You know, very proud of all our members, and I look forward to you know, taking the fight.
Well, I'm wholeheartedly behind you. Look, we hand over our most precious thing, the most precious thing that we will ever have, our children. We hand them over to a stranger, actually. That's how much we trust them. And that stranger keeps them for 7 hours a day and teaches them things that we are not ourselves capable of teaching them, and turns them out, hopefully, an educated and socialized individual. And we'd pay more for a childminder up a tenement stair than we pay per hour to our school teachers. So more power to your pencil, sir. Ross in Cornwall. Now, Richard Medhurst was much praised earlier in the show, and entirely correctly. He too was a speaker at the No to NATO, No to War event in central London. You should check out his speech online on YouTube and no doubt elsewhere. Richard Medhurst has followed the Manchester Arena crime and, more importantly, the crimes that lay behind that crime very closely. And I'm glad that he's here to talk to me about it. Now, Richard, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. I said earlier, before you joined us, that this crime in Manchester was located in a sick mentality of successive British governments who are prepared to support anybody as long as that anybody is against the other person that we oppose. My enemy's enemy is my friend. We're ready to support Nazis in the Ukraine, and we're ready to support ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and in Libya because we didn't like the ruler then. And that exploded. That chicken came home to roost and killed all our beautiful children in Manchester, didn't it?
Yes, it did, George. Thank you for having me on again. And it was great seeing you at the speaking alongside you at the No to NATO rally. The Manchester bombing, as you said, I think it's another sick consequence of our foreign policy because everyone knows by now that in the 1980s, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, the CIA was funneling stingers and weapons and training to the Mujahideen, who later branched off to become Taliban and Al-Qaeda. You can look at history and you see these examples in the last couple of decades of Britain and the United States funding the enemy of our enemy, and then when the Soviets are gone, the ones that we funded become our enemy, and they're suddenly off their leash, so to speak. The Manchester bombing, I think, is really astounding how they censored documents in the inquiry just to protect MI5, and the press say that MI5 could have acted or may have had a chance to act on intelligence as if they didn't know who the bomber was. The thing is that the bomber and his brother, they had gone back to Libya and back to the UK multiple times, right? So they obviously the intelligence agencies, MI5, knew who they were, and then after they commit this terrible this terrorist attack in Manchester in the Ariana Grande concert, they say that maybe we didn't know, or maybe we didn't judge the risk accurately, and that's why MI5 didn't give anything to the counterterrorism police. I mean, this is laziness at best. If we were talking about another sector, if we were talking about maybe hospitals in this case, they'd be fired, because over and over they act like they didn't know and they weren't sure. And there's a whole list of attacks in Europe and the United States that have taken place. Whether we're talking about, for example, the Paris attacks, the police, they had information about the Paris attackers and their radical views before the attack. And they had even used SMS to communicate with each other. SMS, which is unencrypted. So they put in all this mass surveillance to protect us, quote unquote. And then they let attacks happen by people who, number one, they knew about, and number two, were communicating over SMS. The Brussels attacks, the Belgian police in that case, they also knew about these terror cells in 2015. So that's a year before the attacks. In Florida, the FBI, they knew about Nicholas Cruz. The Normandale Park shooting, Colorado shooting, there's a long laundry list of the police knowing about these individuals and letting them do this. Because once again, even if you say it's not their fault, then at best they are absolutely incompetent and should be fired, because they are literally killing people. So at best they're incompetent, and at worst they're complicit by letting these things happen. And then their solution to all this is more mass surveillance, clamping down on civil liberties even more. So I think it's absolutely disgusting that they arm and train these people and then turn the other way and let them carry out these attacks.
Yes, they didn't read Frankenstein, at least until the end. They didn't read it. If they had read it to the end, they'd know that you build these monsters and then they break free. That's why they're called monsters, because you cannot control them. And we have now done this since the 1980s. Arguably, we did it in Egypt in the 1950s by building up the then Islamist trend because we hated Nasser, because he nationalized the Suez Canal running through his country. But leave that aside. From the 1980s, we have been supporting, funding, arming, propagandizing for one after the other of the alphabet soup of Islamist fanaticism. Most recently in Syria, but prior to that in Libya. And it came back and murdered our children.
Yeah, absolutely, George. And the tragedy of this is that they, some people then look at this and think it's a great opportunity to demonize refugees because the Manchester bomber, I believe he was rescued aboard a Royal Navy ship. Yeah, I mean, that's not really the point here. The point is that he was allowed to leave the UK, go fight in Libya, and come back to the UK and never stopped or questioned. That is the issue. It's not that he was rescued aboard a ship among other refugees who could have drowned and were in duress. Because once again, we are the ones creating the refugees. They're for those who claim that refugees are quote unquote invading the West, it's actually the West invading those refugees countries and creating those refugees in the first place. So if you don't want refugees, then don't bomb Libya and don't bomb Iraq and don't bomb Afghanistan. It's very simple. But nevertheless, I think. Syria is again, as you raised, another potent example of that, because Turkey, who's another NATO member state, was letting all these foreign fighters come in and go through the border and let arms go through the border. They basically had a rat line, what you call a rat line of weapons coming in from Libya, and then from people coming from Tunisia, from the UK, from wherever, to go and fight into Syria. And they turned a blind eye. And I fear that what's happening in Ukraine right now, because anyone who knows their history knows that the CIA have been working with these Ukrainian Nazis since the 50s. I fear that now what's happening in Ukraine it has the potential to mimic what we just talked about in terms of Libya and Afghanistan and Syria, where Western intelligence agencies are sponsoring Nazis in this case, or far-right elements, and then at one point in the future, they're going to let loose and start spreading their ideology throughout Europe and committing attacks. I mean, why wouldn't they? We've given them billions of dollars in weapons. I mean, it kind of, what the CIA did with the Mujahideen kind of pales in comparison in terms of the number of weapons that are being flown into Ukraine now. They've got everything they want, maybe jets next, who knows? So I think that's also very concerning, because once the war in Ukraine is over, where do all these weapons go? Who is going to have these weapons? What are they going to do with these weapons? I think that's a very, very concerning question.
It is. We had a big enough problem dealing with Islamist terrorists, but at least you could recognize an Afghan from his turban and his habits from a cave in the Tora Bora. You knew to be alert if they turned up at the door of your local shopping mall. But these Ukrainians that we are arming and building up, they're already in Europe. And as famously was implicitly accepted, they are like us. They act like us until you see their goose-stepping, Sieg-heiling, Nazi tattoos, and we've given them weapons, and they're here already in Europe.
Yeah, George, that's the funny thing, because people who people who are on the far right and who hate refugees, they'd say that they're invading us and they're coming here. I mean, for Afghan refugees and Syrian refugees, and once again, the vast majority are number one, legitimate asylum seekers. They're legitimate refugees, and number two, they are coming because we destroyed their country. They had a very tough time getting in. You look at the difference how Ukrainian refugees are treated, and then how Afghan and Syrian refugees are treated. That's not to say that Europe, especially countries like Germany, didn't welcome them. They did. But they certainly aren't giving the Ukrainian refugees a hard time. And I'm not saying that Ukrainian refugees should have it hard. They shouldn't. That's the whole point. They're asylum seekers. They're fleeing war. They should be helped and rescued. But as you just pointed out, we've let those people who are concerned about refugees What are they going to say about the Ukrainian refugees who got in much more easily? And then in the future, I think there's a tiny risk that you might find among them people on the far right, people who identify as Nazis, who are Banderists, who've continued that line of thinking since World War II. So aren't they concerned about that? Because I haven't heard anything really from the ones complaining about Syrian refugees, complaining about Ukrainian refugees having Trojan horses amongst them. I don't subscribe to that thinking, but I'm just pointing out the hypocrisy. You will hear. Richard Medhurst, as always, thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Let's go to another Richard in Manchester on the bombings. Richard, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. I'm sorry I've not spoken to you for a while. I listen every Sunday to your show, as you're probably aware. I'm a great fan, and you're a great man, and lots of things that you say are absolutely unbelievable and put the ordinary media to shame, because I don't know, I've lost a bit of confidence in the whole lot. But George, I've been following Mrs. Sturgeon and her spin team avidly for the last 2 or 3 years, and noticed this great hate campaign which has been going on, and which is a part of, the fact that she's paying out millions for probably 50, 60 staff to keep the hate campaign going with this spin. I was kicked off Twitter quite some time ago. It doesn't really bother me, but I commented on this several times, and all of a sudden I got an email or whatever to say, in view of the fact that some of the stuff I'd said was fairly controversial, they kicked me off. I fought against it for a while, and I thought, it doesn't really matter. But this thing with the hustings not being allowed in Scotland to be shown live, I was disgusted at that. And my question to you is, if David Linden came on with Andrew Neil, probably 2 or 3 years ago, when independence for Scotland was at its sort of zenith, and we're going to get it and it will be done, and Mrs. Sturgeon, the great goddess, will get us there, and so on and so forth, and Indy Rev 2 and all this money that's gone missing and so on. He said that 3 million immigrants would be allowed to enter Scotland immediately. It had been made a decision. And I just wondered if you got any comments to that, because 3.8 million people did not vote SNP, as you're probably very well aware. And I'm sorry if I'm not putting this very clear.
No, I've got your point, Richard. Just because of the hour, I'll hurry you on. I don't have a lot to say about the SNP because I'm conflicted. I hope it's Hamza, although if it's Hamza Yousaf who becomes the Chief Minister, First Minister of Scotland, it will be extremely bad for Scotland, but only in the short term. It will be more bad and potentially fatal for the separatist cause and for the SNP. So one part of me wants the worst. Now, bring it on. Bring this man, about whom I could say much, but don't have the time to do so tonight. Bring this man to power. Let everyone see what the SNP really is. But another part of me, as a patriotic person that loves my country and more importantly has to live in it, I hope he doesn't get it, because the short-term chaos that he will cause as the First Minister of Scotland will be so calamitous for the people. So I'm conflicted. I spoke about it on Wednesday night, Rich. Look back at what I said about that. Maybe I'll deal with it again nearer the witching hour, when the new First Minister is picked in secret, with no media allowed in to witness what's being said or to question the people who are running for the office. Quadfly 360 sends £1.99. Best show on Sunday evening. Roll on Wednesday. How kind. Rufus Shinra sends $2. Thank you for your reports. I truly value them. Thanks, Rufus. Colnago Cyclist, $2. Greetings from Utah, and God bless Palestine. Mr. Ying, 78, £10. GG, you're like a hot factual knife cutting through the BS of the mainstream media. Keep up the great work, sir. Thank you, Mr. Ying. Paymon Alien sends $10. Thank you, Mr. Galloway. John Flanders, $5. Looking forward to your shows from China. My son works there, as do many Westerners. He does better there than teachers do here. Yeah, we'll be bringing 2 motes next month from China. And I hope you enjoy them. I hope you tune in to them. And I'll, as I say, be spending more time in China over the next year. Alec Gibbs gives £10. All the best. It was great to meet you at the No to NATO rally last week. I knew your cousin Pat in Dundee, and I let her know that you said hello. Thank you, Alec. And God bless Pat Boyle and her remaining family. Richard is in Bradford. Go ahead, Richard.
Hello, George.
Hi.
I would like to talk about, the next general election in the UK, which could be 2024, at the latest, May 2024. See, I was brought up to believe by my dad that the pen is mightier than the sword. So the next general election, I think, like in the 2016 referendum, we, the silent majority, the working class, should go put pen to paper and spoil our papers, as none of these people that we elect represent us. So if at the next general election we go out and spoil our papers, they'll have to read out how many spoiled papers there are, and then out of that can be born a new party called the Spoiled Party that represent the working class of the UK.
Yeah, I don't advocate that tactic, but it is a legitimate tactic. I'll agree. Who else are we going to vote for? I personally, unless I'm standing myself, I'm going to have nobody to vote for. I won't vote for the lesser. Yeah, I won't vote for the lesser of two evils because I couldn't possibly say which of the two was the lesser of two evils. And in any case, voting for the lesser of two evils merely allows evil to win and encourages evil to become ever more evil, because people will always vote for the lesser of two evils. So why not get more and more evil? So spoiling your paper in certain circumstances becomes an entirely legitimate thing to do. But let's hope that we've got better options to vote for in the election. Now, the polls closed. 20,718 people voted. Not quite a record, but pretty close to it. And here's the result. Were COVID lockdowns necessary? Yes, 22%. No, 78% on Twitter. And 3,230 people voted on that platform. On YouTube, 4,596 people voted, and the answer was yes, they were necessary, 18%, no, 82%. On Telegram, 892 people voted, 16% of whom thought that the lockdowns were necessary, 84% thinking not. And on the YouTube community poll, 12,000 people voted. Yes, 18%. No, 82%. What a remarkable poll. What a remarkable set of results. And what a remarkable legend has just appeared on my screen on her 85th birthday. Happy birthday, Norma, in Bristol.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I've been so bold
we're singing.
this weekend.
We're singing.
Oh.
Hip hip hooray! Well done, Norma. 85's no mean age.
That's lovely, George. I mean, really, I'm really bowled over. Honestly, do you know, I wanted to say actually, as well as that, I've got a very big thank you to all the people who responded to my birthday photo on Twitter. Over 700, George.
Wow.
Over 700. And, I mean, I've been very flattered by all the attention.
I must say, you're looking well for 85, Norma.
Have you seen the photo? Oh, my God. You've put it on the screen.
Yeah, there is.
Oh, my granddaughter took it, and I didn't even comb my hair. Oh, dear.
Yeah, you look fabulous. Now, you were born, therefore, in which year?
1938.
Wow. Before the war.
Look at that.
You lived through the Second World War, and here you are, regularly talking on this great platform, on the mother of all talk shows, on the eve of what might be the Third World War. God forbid.
Oh, I know.
Norma, did you do anything special on your birthday today?
Well, I went for... My husband can't hardly walk, but we did go for a cream tea on Friday, and then on Saturday, my family came down with chocolates and flowers and took my photograph. And, I mean, to be honest, I've had so much going on Twitter that it's just blown me away.
Well, you're going to get more now. You're going to get more now.
Oh.
Lang may your lum reek and many happy returns, Norma, in Bristol,
Thank
the
you.
legend, 85 years young. Last call, I think, given the hour. It's Kenny in Acton, another legend. Go ahead, Kenny.
Hi, George. How you doing? Okay?
All right, sir. All right. You were looking fabulous when I saw you last weekend. You've been on that
you too.
keto.
You look like you had lost a good bit of weight as well.
I have, but not quite as much as you. You looked like Elvis.
Thanks to the keto diet. Well,
you looked like Elvis.
Thank you, George. I much appreciate that. Well, when I seen you, I was 81.7 kilos. I'm now down to 80 kilos. So I've actually lost 15 kilos in 9 weeks, and I can attribute that to the Atkins diet or the keto diet, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to... Well, currently, right now, I'm actually 95 hours into a water fast. The last meal I had was Wednesday night. I'm on my 4th day. So I want to speed up the fat loss because I've got another 5 kilos to go, you know?
But are you sure you should be doing it quite as fast as that, Kenny? I mean, there's no hurry, is there?
Yeah. Well, I want a 6-pack for the summer coming in, George.
Don't we all, mate? Don't we all? But they're overrated. I've got one, but they're overrated.
Well, I'm more lean now than I've ever been since I was about 20, so that's made me feel good about myself. You know, I'm the leanest I am since I was 20. But I just first wanted to say that I agree with Donald Trump when he said that China should pay reparations for the damage that they've caused. So since we've now discovered that actually came leaked for the lab in Wuhan.
Who's discovered that?
Well, that's looking like the most plausible scenario. It's not been proven
plausible
beyond
to
doubt
me.
yet.
It's not plausible to me. And when you say things like they have discovered, this presumes some they up there, some deity up there that has pronounced on this. The jury is well and truly out on this point, Kenny. If you want my view, it came from Fort Ettrick, a U.S. military base.
I don't know about that. We'll see what else comes out in the coming months and years, you know.
Anyway, give us a song. Give us a song to finish off.
Okay, here we go. Well, since my baby left me, I found a new place to dwell. It's down it's down at the end of Lonely Street at Heartbreak Hotel where I'll be. I'll be so lonely, baby. Well, I'm so lonely. I'll be so lonely I could die. Well, although it's always crowded, you still could find some room for broken-hearted lovers to cry the gloom and be so. They'll be so lonely, baby. They'll be so lonely they could die.
Wow,
well,
bravo, Kenny.
The bellhouse keys keep flowing. The desk clerks dress in black. They'll be so long on lonely street.
That was a good turn, but it went on too long. Thanks, Kenny. And be careful with these water diets for 3 days at a time. That alarms me a little bit, I must say. Mind you, with all the trials and tribulations in the world today, I suppose the fate of Kenny and Acton's six-pack is the least of our problems. The war drags on. The danger of Norma seeing a third world war, having been born before the second, is very real indeed. Some people ask me why I'm preoccupied by this. I was born in the shadow of the Second World War. Winston Churchill was still the Prime Minister of Britain when I was born. The wartime rationing still existed in the year that I was born. And the world in which I grew up in was entirely shaped by the outcome of the Second World War. And there were many causes of instability, not the least the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I was still a small child, but old enough to know the importance of the things my parents were talking so somberly to each other about, just out of my earshot. And so I lived and grew up and became a man and became politically active in a world that was entirely shaped by the Second World War and its horrors and its loss of the best part of 100 million people. And it's for all those reasons that I dread the idea of World War III, not least because the weapons used in World War II would be like pea shooters compared to the weapons that would quickly become prevalent in any new world war that breaks out over Ukraine. And I just don't think Ukraine is worth it. And neither do you if you are honest and truthful. I've put it to you many times. Let me do so again on the eve of Kupiansk being liberated, which it will be in the next few days or hours. It's not important to me what a town I've never seen, could not spell, and until recently could not pronounce, what side of a line Kupiansk is. It's of no importance to me, Kupiansk. I'm not prepared to die for it. I'm not prepared for you to die for it, for my children or your children to die for it. Kupiansk has been in 4 different countries in the past 100 years. And if it becomes 5 different countries, or remains 4, is a matter of such minuscule importance to me that I can scarcely credit that so many people appear ready to go into the end of humanity over it. This conflict should never have started. Now that it has, it's better that it were quickly ended. And as the Western countries are not going to allow the government in Kiev to negotiate a political ending to this conflict, then it's better that it is settled militarily as quickly as possible and with as little new, more bloodshed than has already been spilt. I gave you numbers earlier. I don't know if you quite grasped them. It is now more or less official that 250,000 Ukrainians have been killed, with another 250,000 wounded, maimed, crippled, with another 30,000 missing, almost certainly also dead. They're burying Ukrainian soldiers 3 in the same grave to minimize the optics of an ever more gigantic war graves, cemeteries spreading across the Ukrainian heartland. I don't hate Ukraine. On the contrary, I always loved it. I was often there in former times. It's heartbreaking to see the suffering of the Ukrainian people, and it has all been for nothing. It has all been because the political regime there has placed the bodies of Ukrainian men and women at the disposal of the President of the United States, Joe Biden, who's currently sitting with the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, on his knee, bouncing him up and down, and probably sniffing his neck. That's all I've got time for, but the good news is, if God spares me, I'll be back on Wednesday at the slightly later time of 9 p.m. UK. Please be there. Please, as Tommy urged you to, tell 10 to tell 10. Bring at least one other viewer for me next Wednesday. That's my challenge to you. Thanks for watching. Good night.